Hello, dear friends. You are on Ruslan Belov's channel, where we traditionally provide daily summaries of events on the Ukrainian front. And as has already become a good tradition, at the very beginning of this episode, I would like to address you with a simple request. If you are not watching my videos for the first time, but for some reason still haven't subscribed to the channel, please do so. By subscribing, you directly support the development of the channel and help it grow. My sincere thanks to everyone who has already subscribed. You know, several episodes ago, I promised to give you a detailed analysis of the prospects that have opened up for the Russian army after what is arguably the most high-profile and resonant victory of the year 2025. Of course, I am referring to the capture of Siversk. And this is truly, without any exaggeration, a colossal success. I have already mentioned this in one of the previous episodes. This operation became one of the most significant precisely because it was carried out flawlessly. Surgically precise, fast, lightning quick and, importantly, within an extremely short time frame. Let me remind you that the city was fully taken in just 26 days, after which the Russian army immediately began advancing further west. Today I propose to speak in detail specifically about the prospects ahead, in which direction the offensive will develop, how difficult the next stages will be, what expectations are realistic, and where illusions should be avoided. In addition, it is important to note that immediately after the capture of Siversk, Russian units advanced on two separate sectors. One of them is already reflected on the map, while the other is not yet shown. The map indicates the capture of one of the elevations north of Sviatopokrovskoye, but it has not yet marked, although it is already confirmed, that the chalk quarry located here has also come under Russian control. Notably, this fact is confirmed not only by Russian sources, but by the Ukrainian side as well. A bit later, I will definitely show you both a relief map and a terrain map, so that you can clearly see and understand what conditions the fighters of the South grouping will face as they continue their advance. But first and foremost, it is necessary to state the main point. The Siversk direction, in its former understanding, no longer exists. What has replaced it? Now we are dealing with the Sloviansk direction, if we speak about the overall vector of movement. Yes, the Siversk direction has effectively transformed into the Sloviansk one, since the key objective and the primary axis of advance is, without question, the city of Sloviansk. From the current positions, the distance to it is approximately 26 kilometers. However, it is crucial here to understand one fundamental point. It would be one thing if the terrain consisted of flat plains, as for example in the Zaporizhia or Dnipropetrovsk regions, where the east grouping is currently advancing, open fields, wide spaces. But the situation here is completely different. This area is characterized by constant elevation changes, hills, and complex terrain. Nevertheless, let us examine what movement vector is currently taking shape. As you can see, Russian units managed to capture the first elevation extending from Siversk for roughly 10 kilometers all the way to Kaliniki, naturally with certain variations in height. Let me even show you visually how this looks. Here is Siversk, and here is the elevation located north of Sviatopokrovskoye. This is where we are now, meaning that Russian forces have already fully occupied this entire section. And you can clearly see the difference in elevation here. This means that from the current positions, Sviatopokrovskoye is literally in plain sight. And it is absolutely obvious that once Russian forces secured this height, the days of Sviatopokrovskoye under AFU control were effectively numbered. Holding the settlement under such conditions is impossible. It turns into a shooting gallery. Absolutely any movement inside the village from these heights will be detected and engaged. But there is another important point. Immediately beyond Sviatopokrovskoye lies the next settlement, stretched along this very same elevation, the village of Reznikovo, and here the situation is exactly the same. Whoever controls the height controls the settlement. However, there is also a nuance. One elevation gives way to another, with a lowland between them, and to the west there is an even higher elevation. From there, the enemy will attempt to slow down the Russian advance. I am showing this to you so that you clearly understand the terrain features and immediately discard the first and most common expectation, the expectation of a rapid breakthrough. That will not happen here. Yes, the tempo of the offensive will likely be higher than before, since Siversk had long absorbed significant enemy forces. But given the terrain specifics, it is simply impossible to accelerate here. And I will say this: the section up to Krivaya Luka is, figuratively speaking, just the beginning. The real challenges start further on. Let me turn on the elevation map so that you can see everything as clearly as possible. And by the way, an interesting point. The Ukrainian side is now actively promoting a narrative claiming that fighting for Siversk lasted 3 years. This, to put it mildly, does not correspond to reality. Yes, Russian troops entered Siversk in July 2022. I also mentioned this in one of the episodes, but that assault was unsuccessful, and the units were forced to withdraw, pulling back as far as the Luhansk region. The second entry into Siversk occurred only in mid-November. Thus, the fighting for the city lasted not 3 years, but less than a month. But as they say, each side tries to soften the bitterness of defeat in its own way. Now let us return once again to the terrain and elevations. Look, Siversk lies in a lowland. Then come the very elevations I showed you earlier. See the shade? Slightly reddish. And now look to the west. This is exactly what will stand in the way towards Sloviansk. Elevations, elevations, and once again elevations. I think it is now clear why I constantly emphasize that it is impossible to maintain a high tempo of advance here. These 26 kilometers will be extremely difficult. Returning to the standard map, let us identify the key point. The key objective on this axis is reaching Rye Oleksandrivka. Moreover, movement in this direction has already begun from the Vasyukivka and Pazeno areas. Thus, if hostilities continue in the coming months, and, judging by everything, peace in the foreseeable future is unlikely, we will see the following development. From the Siversk side, the chain will be Sviatopokrovskoye, Reznikovo, Kaliniki, Rye Oleksandrivka. And from the Vasyukivka and Pazeno side, movement toward Nikiforivka, and then further to Rye Oleksandrivka as well. As a result, a kind of bridgehead will be formed here, where clearing operations will be conducted from both the southern and northern directions. After that, the route from Rye Oleksandrivka to the town of Mykolaiivka will open up, and then a direct approach to Sloviansk. This is exactly the picture that, in my opinion, we will observe in the coming months. As for timing, I deliberately refrain from making rigid forecasts, because the sectors are extremely difficult. Nevertheless, reaching and taking Rye Oleksandrivka by June seems wholly realistic to me. It may happen even earlier. I always try to give restrained, even pessimistic forecasts, simply to avoid inflated expectations and subsequent disappointment. It is better for reality to turn out faster and more successful than predicted than the other way around. That is why I say, by June is entirely achievable, possibly even earlier. As I have already noted, due to the complex terrain and constant elevation changes, making predictions here is a thankless task. And now, reflecting on this, I want to return to what I said at the beginning of the episode. At the very start, I said that the Siversk direction had become the Sloviansk direction. However, that formulation may not be entirely accurate. Yes, the overall movement is toward Sloviansk, but it is still 26 kilometers away, which is significant in itself, and considering the terrain, very significant. Therefore, it would be more accurate to call this the Rye Oleksandrivka direction. Rye Oleksandrivka is the key point on the road to Sloviansk and the nearest strategic objective. From the current positions, the distance to it is approximately 12 kilometers. Thus, we have outlined the prospects that are opening up for the Russian army. Now let us move on to the advances recorded over the past day. On the Kupiansk axis, there have been certain successes. Not in Kupiansk itself, the situation there remains consistently difficult, but on the left bank of the Oskil River. Footage of objective control has appeared showing that Russian units advanced by about 1 kilometer and entered the eastern part of Kurilivka. Kurilivka is an important settlement on the way to Kupiansk-Vuzlovyi. It is still difficult to say how firmly they have consolidated their positions, since this is only the initial foothold on the eastern outskirts. But the main thing is that movement is underway, and that is a fact. In addition, a critically important advance took place in the area of responsibility of the East grouping. This time it is not in the Zaporizhzhia region, but in the Dnipropetrovsk region. Russian fighters managed to cross the Huliaipole River and take control of the village of Pischana. Why do I emphasize the significance of this success? First, this is already the western bank of the Huliaipole, meaning a breakthrough of yet another segment of the defensive line. As I mentioned in yesterday's episode, the river has already been crossed at 3 different sectors and settlements have been taken. Second, provided that this bridgehead can be held, and this is now the key task, further developments involve reaching the railway lines and then advancing toward Ternavate from the north. And Ternavate represents several critically important factors at once. First, it is a dominant elevation. Second, it is a major logistical hub, as several roads converge there. And third, it is not a village, but an urban-type settlement. If it is taken, the Huliaipole defensive line will effectively cease to exist as a unified defensive system. In addition to this, very positive news has also come from the Huliaipole direction. Russian forces broke into the southern part of the settlement and managed to make significant advances inside the populated area. Notably, the Ukrainian resource deep state has already been forced to mark part of these Russian advances on its maps. This indicates that the clearing of the entire southern part of Huliaipole is proceeding at full pace. What is especially telling is that only a short amount of time has passed, yet the Russian army has already taken control of a substantial portion of this large settlement. Let me remind you that Huliaipole consists of thousands of houses, and each one of these houses can theoretically be turned into a firing position where the enemy can entrench itself. However, judging by the current dynamics, the Ukrainian army's infantry situation is so dire that it simply lacks the manpower to occupy even prepared and defensively suitable buildings. This is precisely why the clearing operations conducted by Russian units are proceeding at a pace we have not previously observed. Significant progress has also been recorded in the northern part of the settlement. Here, Russian forces advanced just as confidently. The river was crossed, and the units managed to firmly entrench themselves inside Huliaipole. At present, it can be stated that approximately 30 to 40% of the settlement is already under Russian control. And I can say this with complete certainty. Things are going very, very well for the Russian army in Huliaipole. When I previously said that Huliaipole would most likely be taken around January-February, I was, as usual, voicing my pessimistic forecast. However, against the backdrop of the latest news, a real chance has emerged that events will develop much faster. And it is entirely possible that by the end of the current month, or at the very beginning of January, Huliaipole will fully come under Russian control. Well then, that concludes my overview of the operational situation on the front for today. Now let us move on to the situation on the political stage. Ukraine is rejecting the demands of the United States, The Guardian reports. Negotiations between the Ukrainian and American sides held in Berlin ended without any agreements on the key issue, territorial matters. According to the outlet, the meeting lasted about 2 hours, but disagreements over Donbass were not resolved. According to the publication, the American delegation insisted on the withdrawal of Ukrainian armed forces units from the Donetsk and Luhansk regions as a condition for advancing peace talks with Russia. The Kyiv regime, in turn, strongly resisted these demands. A source familiar with the course of the consultations reported that Kyiv's representatives refused even to discuss a troop withdrawal and effectively blocked any movement on the territorial track. The Americans are demanding that Ukraine leave Donbass, but Kyiv categorically refuses, the source says. As a result, the Berlin talks ended without any outcome. The territorial dispute remains unresolved, and pressure from the United States has only highlighted the deepening rift between Washington and the Kyiv regime over the future of Donbass. At the same time, Zelensky concluded a number of agreements with German defense companies, reaching deals on the production of another batch of drones. Naturally, the hand of the Kremlin is once again being seen everywhere. The head of European diplomacy, Kaja Kallas, stated that the only way to finance Ukraine is by seizing Russian funds. According to her, the European Union will not be able to agree on financing Ukraine through the issuance of Eurobonds. That is why, Kallas believes, the most preferable option is the so-called reparations loan, which the EU is currently working on. We have not reached this yet, and it is difficult, but we are doing our work. "We still have a few days," she said before the meeting of EU foreign ministers. At the same time, Kallas proudly noted that the EU had fulfilled its commitment to supply Ukraine with 2 million artillery shells in the year 2025. "We have reached the target under our initiative of 2 million shells, which are necessary for Ukraine's defense," she emphasized. "Let me remind you that on December 3rd, the European Commission approved a plan to provide Ukraine with a so-called reparations loan in the amount of 165 billion euros through the seizure of frozen Russian assets. The European Commission expects that Germany, France and Italy will bear the main burden of securing this loan. However, so far, aside from Berlin, no one has officially declared readiness to participate in this scheme." At the same time, Hungary, Slovakia and Belgium have openly opposed the European Commission's proposal. As of today, 7 EU countries are opposing the reparations loan: Belgium, Italy, Bulgaria, Malta, the Czech Republic, Hungary and Slovakia. Formally, approval does not require consensus, but a qualified majority, and these votes may not be enough to block the initiative. However, without Belgium's consent, where a significant portion of Russian assets is located, it is still impossible to implement the plan. Therefore, much now depends on the position of Bart de Wever. Meanwhile, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán urged everyone to fasten their seatbelts, stating that Europe faces a difficult week that will determine the future. He wrote about this on the social media platform X. Orbán reminded that a meeting of the European Commission will take place in Brussels this week, with the central topic being the coordination of details of the plan to finance Ukraine using frozen Russian assets, the very same reparations loan. "The stakes are clear: war or peace. Never before have we been so close to ending the Ukrainian crisis. Europe stands on the threshold of a historic step, because the war that we Europeans have failed to end for 4 years may soon be ended by the Americans," Orbán wrote. He also stated that Europe is effectively seeking the continuation of the conflict and its expansion from the front line into the economic sphere. In his view, confiscating frozen Russian assets would be tantamount to an open declaration of war, to which Russia would inevitably respond with reciprocal measures. Orbán called on European leaders to follow the example of the United States and begin negotiations with Russia. As they say, draw your own conclusions. Trump is splitting the European Union. A former ally is turning into an enemy, writes the Financial Times. A coordinated attack by Donald Trump on the EU this month, including a new national security strategy and a series of sharp statements by the US president, has caused shock within the European Commission and sparked intense debates over how to respond. The absence of a clear official reaction has only worsened the situation. As a result, a number of national EU leaders decided to bypass the European Commission and move to direct negotiations with Washington. This dealt a serious blow to the previous approach, under which the EU negotiated with the United States as a unified bloc of 27 countries. The situation was further aggravated by Trump's stance against using Russian assets to finance Ukraine. This position found support among the leaders of Belgium, Hungary, Slovakia, the Czech Republic, Italy, Bulgaria and Malta. The section on Europe in the new US national security strategy became a major scandal. It undermines 80 years of bipartisan policy. The Trump administration has effectively declared war on the European Union. This had been clear for some time, but it has now been formalized as official policy. "Our friends have now become our enemies," said former US Ambassador to the EU Anthony Gardner. According to the British Daily Mail, Trump intends to push for 4 countries to leave the European Union. In effect, Trump wants the EU to fall apart.